I showed you last week on this program and in Kenny on Media how the ABC's been misreporting and misrepresenting events in the Middle East. Incredibly, they've portrayed Israel as the aggressor, telling audiences that Hamas rocket attacks have occurred in retaliation for Israeli bombings. Here are a couple of examples from the ABC.
A series of explosions lit up the night in northern Gaza, signalling airstrikes by the Israeli military. In response, the militant group Hamas has fired hundreds of rockets at Israeli cities.
In retaliation, Hamas and other militant groups fired hundreds of rockets into Israel.
Yeah, poor Hamas and those other militants having to fire back and retaliate against the onslaught from Israel. Astonishing, isn't it? And to be frank, it's typical of the media coverage you get of this issue in this country. The media is dominated by the Green Left, and this is one of those emblematic issues, as you know, where they attack Israel and instinctively take what they see as the pro-Palestinian line. Now, you only had to see this station today to see that the Palestinian line gets very, very good coverage, and you would have seen plenty of pro-Palestinian opinions on this station today from former Foreign Minister Bob Carr, from a man who was the ambassador of what he calls the State of Palestine, which doesn't actually exist yet, and also from this representative of the Australian Palestinian community.
Israel's a nuclear-armed state. You know, there is no parity when you talk about a conflict. I'm no fan of Hamas, but I really, really don't like Israel and its heavy-handed military operations.
There you go, the full gamut of opinions on this station, but that sort of moral equivalence is odious, isn't it? Israel is big and he doesn't like Israel, so this justifies rockets attacks fired at civilian targets in Israel, deliberately killing innocent people. It's just not on this sort of stuff, but it's typical of the attitudes reflected in our media, which, whether by design or not, can only give succour to the terrorists, because the violence such as we're seeing now is not really about Palestinians versus Israel. It's Hamas terrorists versus Israel. Hamas targets civilians indiscriminately. Israel tries to target Hamas ruthlessly. It's a horror, to be sure, but there's no moral equivalence. The civilians of Gaza, like the civilians in Israel, are often the innocent victims in all of this. Yet, incredibly, journalists in Australia, with the encouragement of the Journalists' Union, are signing up to an open letter complaining about the coverage of these issues. Not because of this anti-Israel bias, but because they don't think it's sufficiently pro-Palestinian in this country. Now, this letter even cites the destruction of the media building in Gaza, where Israel warned all the occupants to get out. No one was hurt when it targeted the building because it says Hamas military intelligence operations were based there. So this new open letter cites the bombing of this building as evidence that Israel is targeting journalists. Seriously? Anyway, the journalist letter claims that there is a growing dissatisfaction here and elsewhere with the media's treatment of what they call Palestine. It goes on to call for more coverage of the Palestinian perspective and says we should respect the rights of journalists to express personal solidarity with the Palestinian cause without penalty in their professional lives. This is extraordinary. Apparently dozens of journalists have signed this in Australia, no doubt many from the ABC. So journalists who give us anti-Israel bias in their reporting are now looking to get more support for their anti-Israel campaigning, and they even demand immunity from criticism for their bias. They reckon they ought to be able to campaign against Israel instead of being objective journalists, but be free from any sanction professionally over this. It's just more proof that the Journalists' Union is a big part of the problem in this era of fake news. Let's catch up with the Director of Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs, Gideon Rosner. Gideon, I know you keep an eye on this stuff, but this is extraordinary. You know, journalists are sexually wanting to campaign for a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel angle on all of this, but not be called out for it.
Well, there are two parts to that, Chris. Firstly, the journalists want to campaign. Now, that's not the definition of journalism as I understand it. Journalism should be about reporting objective fact, not pushing a barrow or an agenda for a particular side, including people who, by the way, want to use our tax dollars, as you said, on the ABC, to effectively advocate for the actions of a listed terrorist organisation. But the other point to be made, that's the obvious one that you articulated very well, is the media is too biased towards Israel. Since when? I've been following the media when it comes to issues about Israel my entire life, and it has always been very, very pro-Palestinian, and it's getting worse. How often do you hear, Chris, on news bulletins that the evictions in a part of Jerusalem that set this all off were effectively squatters who refused to pay rent? How often do you hear about things like the fact that Israel will call up a building before it bombs it and warn the occupants to get out? I mean, no other country in the world sends out a save the date card for a military occupation, for military exercise, but that's exactly what Israel does in the name of being humane, and they're the oppressors and the occupiers. It is an absolute joke.
Yeah, it is extraordinary because this media coverage, as you say, uses all these old tricks, and it's about a body count and it's about one person's military might versus the other. They portray it as Palestinians versus Israel rather than what it actually is, and that is Hamas and other terrorist groups attacking Israeli citizens. And shockingly, on both sides of the border, between the Palestinian territories and Israel, innocents are getting killed. That is shocking. But one side is trying to minimise the casualties on the civilian side. The other is trying to maximise them.
That's right, and it's not as if we shouldn't feel deeply sorry and sympathise with the Palestinian people. I sympathise with the Palestinian people, but the source of their anguish and their suffering is not the state of Israel. It is their corrupt, murderous leadership that has kept them languishing in refugee camps for 70 years instead of building a homeland for them, and is using them as human shields to use the deaths of their own people effectively as a propaganda device. The Palestinian Authority, or the Hamas, I should say, is deliberately doing this so as to get a media reaction like the ones we're seeing in this country, and the left-wing media in Australia and elsewhere falling for hook, line and sinker.
What does it say about the Journalists' Union, though, when they're circulating this open letter? They support this point of view. They just don't care about this bias. They encourage it.
They encourage it. It shows a few things. It shows that, for one thing, that they're bad journalists. They can't actually research the facts. All of what I've told you could be revealed by a quick Google search. It could be revealed by talking to Palestinian people who have actually left the Palestinian territories because of persecution, for example. And that's another point that has to be made. It's funny to see all these left-wing journalists who support, LGBT agendas and all sorts of other things. In fact, they say on Twitter there can be no queer liberation without Palestinian liberation. Well, go to Ramallah or Gaza City and see how far being, an openly LGBT person gets you in those places. There's only one place in the Middle East where gay people are accepted unquestionably and have full legal rights, and that's the state of Israel.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Gideon. I appreciate it.
Cheers, Chris.
Bit of clarity with the facts there from Gideon Rosner. It is shocking. It's a shocking situation. We all want a peaceful resolution, but we've got to deal in facts.